Here on the Colour of Country Life FlowFM, we're catching up with the ANU's Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, John Blaxland. How are you, John?
Great. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the program.
It's a pleasure. We like to rely on our academics when it comes to these very technical subjects where when you're looking at the progress of what's happening in Ukraine, there's been some remarkable developments in the last week or so. You've been tracking it, I imagine, for some time.
Yeah, no, it is quite extraordinary. We've seen a breakthrough that speaks to a turnaround that has been building for some time, but no one quite anticipated it being on this scale. We know that the Ukrainians have been preparing for an offensive. We know that they've been training for several months. They've been getting reinforcements in terms of equipment and munitions and supplies. And they've been preparing themselves with a lot of talk about an offensive, but it was supposed to be in the south, not the northeast. And I think this is what's really surprised everybody. The deception of claiming that the main focus was going to be south and turning then to the northeast has thrown the Russians for a loop, and they've been, absolutely flummoxed as they've been pushed back. And it speaks to a remarkable breakdown in resolve in the Russians, and the morale has clearly suffered, and the Ukrainians, it's extraordinary. You think back, Vladimir Zelensky 6 months ago was talking about pushing the Russians out and total victory, and at the time it just seemed, fairyland talk. But clearly he's inspired the Ukrainian people. He's inspired the world to support, or much of the world to support Ukraine, to enable this to happen. And here we are, a week into this offensive, and much of the territory that Russia has taken over the last 4 or 5 months has been reclaimed. Now, not everything. There's still quite a lot of territory that remains in Russian hands, and this isn't over completely at all yet. There's still quite a lot of fighting that can go on. But it is a very positive sign for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's. I'm looking at the territory map here of what Russia was occupying before and what they've taken since late February. It does seem that they are being pushed back from Kiev initially, and then also Kharkiv we've seen in the northeast. It sounds like the Russians are now having to make a terrible choice given that surprise offensive of, do they move resources from the south to try and recapture in Kharkiv, or do they give that up?
Well, that's right. And it's quite a dilemma, because Vladimir Putin's made a rod for his own back by declaring it a special military operation, by refusing to, basically mobilise the nation for the war. He's left himself with his hands tied behind his back, in the sense that Russia, which is a much bigger country, has not been able to throw as many people at this problem as they would otherwise have thought. And so on the battlefield itself, the numbers are actually not that different, and Ukraine is able to exploit the morale effect and the fact that they're fighting for their homeland, and the Russians are kind of interlopers, and they know it. They know that they're not welcome. They know that the Ukrainian people don't want them there, and it's very hard to fight for territory that you don't really feel legitimately, entitled to hold, and that's clearly been what's unravelled in the last few days.
What role can we tell has the Western aid played in all of this? I'm seeing reports that the military equipment that's been provided to Ukraine has helped them step up their game as well.
So it's helped considerably, but it's been the training and supply of equipment, equipment and munitions. Australia's supplied armoured vehicles, our Bushmasters, and I've been watching some video clips of Ukrainian soldiers thanking Australia for the vehicles that have helped save Ukrainian lives. Of course, there's been a range of other things, the Turkish Bayraktar unattended aerial vehicle. There's been British anti-tank munitions, American anti-tank munitions, but the one that's featured most prominently in the last couple of months is the HIMARS, the multiple launch rocket system that enables the Ukrainians to fire with incredible accuracy up to 80 kilometres away. So they've used that to target railway junctions, command control headquarters, logistic support bases, bridges, river crossings, and compounds of vehicles and stores and stuff. well back in, behind the so-called front line, and that's completely flummoxed the Russians because after the failure of their initial surge on Kiev, which was kind of an attempt to stage a coup de main, a kind of a quick overthrow the government and set up a puppet regime, that clearly failed. So they've reverted to World War II tactics effectively, which is, the Russians in 1944 to 45 were masterful at being able to roll back the Germans through intense firepower. They just destroyed everything before them, and no German forces could sustain that. Those tactics are the ones they've effectively reverted to now, but they don't have the forces that they had in 1944-45. Now, they've demobilised much of their army, and they don't have the defence industry to sustain the demand for munitions. So they've gone through a lot of that old-time equipment. They've gone through a lot of the old munitions. They've destroyed a lot in the way. And what have they got to prove for it? A wasteland that they can't properly control. And the precision-guided munitions that the US and others have supplied have just shown up the inappropriateness of those old-style, mass destruction approaches to warfare when you can actually achieve your results without that level of destruction simply by going for key nodes. It's quite a significant lesson now. I mean, pundits are going to be studying this for some time to come, but what this clearly demonstrates is that you really need long-range precision munitions if you want to be in the game.
Yeah, we're speaking with John Blaxland, the ANU Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, and we're looking at, on the Friday here on the Flow Network, we're always covering the agricultural markets, and they've been moving up and down in expectation of what may or may not happen in the Black Sea. It seems that all markets are now pricing a broader range of outcomes in this conflict than just the initial expectation it would be over very quickly. It's a crystal ball exercise, but with what we're seeing now, could we still see a protracted war or some sort of ceasefire develop?
So it really is still hard to tell because what it boils down to is what's going to happen in Russia, largely because Russia has the resources to continue to fight this war ad infinitum if they want to. The question is, does Vladimir Putin, does the elite in Moscow have the ticker to continue fighting? And that's, especially when you think, well, what the hell, what's the point of this fight? It's very hard, and it's been interesting to watch some of the news coming out of Russian television about the fights in some of the current affairs shows between pundits about what the hell's going on and what they should do about it, Of course, what that points to is the prospect of things potentially getting even worse, and that's the scary bit because, a cornered bear, if you like, a cornered and wounded bear can actually lash out and do a lot of harm. And they have the ability still to do a lot of harm. And they've demonstrated that in the last couple of days by targeting Kharkiv and the water and electricity infrastructure of the city, making basically an act of spite, essentially. If we can't have your territory, then we can at least make it so that you can barely live there. And with winter approaching, damaging the electricity and water supply infrastructure points to a really, really difficult, barren winter ahead for the people of Ukraine, let alone those in occupied territory occupied by Russia.
Yeah, that's a critical point as we look at this discussion that's happened and accusations that Russia has not only weaponized food when it comes to coming out of the Black Sea region, but even energy itself and its own energy resources, holding Europe somewhat hostage to what they were previously relying on from Russia. And it's seen countries change, I guess, their energy focus because of this accusation they've weaponized these energy and food outputs. Do you think they're good, fair criticisms of the Putin administration, or are they just natural consequences of a war situation?
No. This is a consequence of not just Putin's administration, but the naive kind of and folly of many countries in Europe of looking to Russia for the overwhelming majority of their fossil fuel supply, and without having put in mitigating levers to offset the risks of Russia using that as a weapon against them. Now, we've seen Russia do this a number of times over the last decade or so, where Putin's kind of punished a country by claiming that they had to close off gas for maintenance purposes in the middle of winter. This is classic kind of bully boy behaviour, and yet particularly Germany and other countries have only belatedly come to the realisation that this is the path to perdition. This is not a sustainable trajectory for the country. They need to diversify. They need to get away from Russian oil and gas.
Now, that's the sort of immediate cost, and certainly with winter coming, a very concerning one. But what is there a figure or an estimate sort of where we're up to at the moment in terms of the horrible damage? I mean, there's a human toll as well, but in terms of the reconstruction costs in Ukraine would be massive. Do we know what that cost might be, and what chance might there be that Russia might be forced to actually help pay for that reconstruction?
It's going to be a tall order expecting Russia to pay for that reconstruction. The only way you could do that would be to actually conquer Russia itself, and that's just not even remotely on the table. Russia retains some considerable agency here, and I think we need to be realistic about expectations of what we can expect Russia to do in reparations. Having said that, we know that there are frozen funds, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of frozen Russian funds in Western banks. So depending on how countries like the United States and the Europeans want to play this, there is a potential for some of that money to be diverted to help rehabilitate the war-damaged Ukraine.
Now, I know there was a eye-watering cost when it came to the Afghanistan conflict that went for a lot longer. Do we have any sort of idea what are we talking, billions, or hundreds of billions, or trillions so far in terms of damage within Ukraine?
So I haven't seen authoritative figures on this yet, but we're talking well on the way. Half a $1 trillion at least here. We're talking serious amounts of money. 500 billion probably is the ballpark I'd be looking at. It's a serious amount of money.
Yeah, it certainly is, and it is one we've been following. It's more than 6 months in a war that many said would only last 100 days, but appreciate your updates on just how that's been tracking. Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at ANU, John Blaxland, thanks very much for your time today.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.